Is the mini quiz, which was done very well by people last week, of the sort of third or so of people who completed it. But there was one question, so most of the questions, 3 of the questions, no problems at all. There was one question which caused an issue for some people, and I thought I'd just go through it quickly. So the question was, what is the earliest point at which testing can produce useful results? So the potential answers are before coding starts, after refactoring is complete, at the end of the first iteration, at the start of implementation. Okay, so the important thing to think about with this question is we're talking about testing in general terms. So we haven't mentioned a particular type of testing. So we haven't said unit testing, we haven't said integration testing. So that will affect, therefore, how we think about these answers. So obviously, if we're writing unit tests, then this is part of implementation. So you might, if you're doing test-driven development, start writing tests at the start of implementation, right? So testing can provide a useful result pretty early on. But actually, it's possible to think about testing differently. So we go through with the customer our acceptance tests, and we pin these down quite early on. But I also mentioned last week that you can do things like test user interfaces before you even get to implementation. So actually, the point at which you can start testing something is before implementation starts. And in fact, with something like a user interface, which you can mock up, you can get feedback from the customer on that before you actually do any coding, which is great. So getting that feedback, going through that process, is a kind of testing that we can do even before implementation starts. So that is the correct answer. So about half of people got that, I think. Okay, so we're now going to move on to test fixtures, aren't we, Rob?
We are, yep. Okay, so I just wanted to, this is a very short section, I just wanted to discuss test fixtures with you, because I think it's something that we're going to discuss it next week. I brought it forward because I had a couple of questions, and indeed one of the stories for today's for the sprint, which starts today, sprint 4, actually has what we would describe as a test fixture in it. So what is a test fixture? Basically, a fixture is context for a test. Has anyone come across test fixtures, by the way, before? Hand up, but most people looking a bit doubtful. So you probably have, and this is and you certainly have in the lab, but it's not being called out. So this is why I want to do that. Okay, so it's context for a test. Basically, it is baseline fixed state within which you run a test, and so it might be the fixtures might be commonly referred to as the actions that you perform to bring a system into such a state by which you can then run some tests. And it's very typical in unit test frameworks to have them, and it's generally that you put in fixtures everything that must be in place in order to run a test and expect a particular outcome. So examples of these are, because that all sounds slightly slightly sort of esoteric, so let's concretise this. So an example would be files with specific data. That's one of the most simple test fixture. I keep wanting to say text fixture, it's a bit of a tongue twister, it seems. Test fixture. So files with specific data in them. So sometimes you want to run a test where you're searching for something within a file, and so you should have a consistent file with which you're searching. So that could be an example of a fixture. It could be loading specific tables into a database, which of course is something that will happen in the tests for your lab code. It could be installing clean versions of other software that are part of the test harness, and we use the word test. We use this concept of a test harness as the name for software used to systematically run reproducible tests on a piece of software under test. So, for example, continuous integration software be part of the test harness. Something that's not the test, but something within which the tests are running. So obviously, if you're testing some, however complex code against different operating systems, different libraries installed into those operating systems, you want that to be consistent, and so you'd have that all set up as part of the test harness, and these things individually are fixtures within that. It could be preparation of input data. So for example, if you're testing something against random numbers, for example, which is obviously difficult to do with actually purely random numbers, but most random number generators allow you to give it a seed so that you can predict what numbers it's going to produce. So preparation of input data might be including a seed into a random number generator or something like that. Okay, so that's the sorts of things that a fixture is. Basically, it's anything that you have sort of external to your tests that you're using to help run your tests, and it's to make sure that everything is clean and tested the same way each time. So why do we use fixtures? Well, it's very useful to separate the test initialization and destruction, if required, from the actual testing. So you might have this phase where you set up loads of things for a test, then run the tests, and then sort of close things down. So if you are maybe in your integration tests, you're actually going to test against a test database. So in the test initialization, you'll make sure the database is running. You'll make sure that you have a connection to it. And then in the test, you will just test against that database. And then in the destruction part after the test, you would close the connection to the database. And the nice thing about this is if you put all of that into your test, then you kind of obfuscate what the actual test is. I mean, you'd still be able to read it and work it out, but there'd be a lot of boilerplate in a test there. And also, the likelihood is you want to test multiple times against the same database, and you always want it to be in that clean state. So if you put the setup in separately to the tests, you can set up, test, destruct, set up, test, destruct, set up, test, destruct. You're not having to rewrite all that code in every single test. So yes, separate the tests and the test data, and make sure we can reuse a known state for more than one test. So typically, I'll go through the phases of testing now. So typically, you set up the fixtures, and anything else you need to do. You actually exercise the system that you're testing in some way, in some controlled way with your test. Then you verify that whether you've actually got the expected outcome, and that's where the assertions come in to play, and then you tear down anything you need to tear down. Now obviously 2 and 3 are often conflated onto the same line in your test. It's often that you will assert, say, true, and then run the actual method that you're calling. But in some cases, if it's a particularly complex thing, you might actually, and you want to verify a number of things after you've run a method, you might actually run the method and then have some verification afterwards. And sometimes you don't need to do this last step. You only need to actually explicitly do the teardown step if you just abandoned the database connection, and left it hanging. It might mean that the next test can't run because some connection's still open. So you only need to do step 4 if it's going to be required for running the next test. So I'll give an example of a test that you've actually got in the lab. So we've got our setup method here, and that's setting up some sort of directory that we're going to so we've got a directory, and we're going to actually set up a path to a file, path to our data. And we just set up that in the setup, so we don't have to do it in every other test. And then here we create a database. This is our actual test. We create a database. We do an assertion. where we're reading from that path, which is our sample database here, and then we do an actual call on, we say data we get back is going to be provided by this method, and then we actually do a couple of assertions on that. So we've actually split the assertions out from the exercise there. So this is an actual test in the code you have. There are two fixtures that we would consider to be fixtures in this code. Can anyone point out what they might be? Anyone call out? Yeah?
The setup.
Sorry?
The setup.
So in the setup itself, actually this one's a little bit odd. It's doing some setup to find where the data is, but the path to the data probably isn't considered to be a fixture. Any other thoughts? Two fixtures. So this file here is a fixture. This is some acceptance data that's going to be read from the path that we set up in the setup section. So that's a fixture, and actually the database itself is a fixture. Now, so in the previous what I was just saying before, I said you would generally sort of create databases and load files and so on in your setup. So this could be maybe made a bit more efficient by doing that. You could move these. You could move the database setup certainly into the setup. Now, a reason why you might not do it every time is that there might be lots of other tests in this file, and they may not all need to use the database. So typically, what you'll find in a class, in a test class, is that the setup is called before every single one of these test methods. So if not everyone uses a database, then you might actually just create the database in the method. So it's flexible. So long as it's created, you can do it where you like. And that's an improvement that you might make if you realised that everything was creating a database. So there's various stages that I talked about before. So that's stage 1 setup, stage 2, and stage 2 is the exercise, and stage 3 is the verification. And there's no stage 4. We're not tearing down. Yes?
Is this similar to the 3A principle of arrange, act, insert?
Sorry?
Is this similar to the arrange, act, insert pattern that people sometimes
Yeah. So set everything up. Yeah. Okay. So I said it was going to be fairly short, so that's all I wanted to say about test fixtures. Did it again. Yes?
When you need the fourth point, or the fourth step?
Sorry, say again?
When we need to do the fourth step?
So you don't always need to do the fourth step, the tearing down. You only need to do that. So the reason why we're not sort of tearing down this database is because it's based on a file, and so whenever you generally, in the case of whenever you run a script or a computer program, things like files are closed automatically when it exits, and so we're taking advantage of that to not doing it specifically. But if you were connecting to a test database that was, say, got to via network connection, then you might need to actually specifically close that network connection. Otherwise, leaving it open might prevent the next test from running it. So you don't always need to tear down, but if you're finding that the first test runs and then everything else fails, it might be because you need to actually clean up a bit more for the first test.
Are the fixtures always allocated in the second step, which is exercise?
Are they always used in the second step?
Yeah.
Well, no. So not all tests have fixtures. So not all tests need fixtures. So, for example, when we went through the Fibonacci TDD example, that was just testing against raw numbers. So it was calling the Fibonacci method and just making sure that it equaled like 1 or 3 or something like that. So there's no fixtures there. They're just raw numbers.
If there is any fixtures, should it be always in the exercise?
So if you can only exercise your code with the use of fixtures, then they will be included in that step. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Right. So.
Okay, so I thought it would be helpful. So we've been talking about agile in inverted commas, like it's a thing, in particular with regard to Scrum, which is the process you are sort of following at the moment. And I thought this week we could look a little bit at some of the limitations that might be associated with the process. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk about some alternative approaches and some of the difficulties that people have implementing agile within the organisation now. We're also going to talk a little bit later on about reflection. So this is in relation to the reflection you'll be doing specifically, but more importantly in relation to actually understanding what's going on and how to use that technique for improving the way that we employ processes. So let's start at this point. So there are some people here, okay, and some of the people really like agile and they're the fun ones. And some of them really hate agile, right? And they're the big corporations that and actually, I said at the beginning of the course that it's much more common now for industry to employ agile processes, which is true. So they are very gradually becoming embedded. Many different types of processes very gradually becoming embedded in industry. However, and I need to look at the latest Gartner report to get the precise number, but certainly last year the vast majority of companies were still following a waterfall method. Okay, so it is not the case, even though particularly in the UK and there are quite a number of industries which were more agile, so ThoughtWorks, BBC, yay, but actually there are lots and lots of places where agile processes are not so well embedded, and I think that one of the things that I think is important to consider is culture and context. So we've discussed about sort of from a sort of personal perspective, some people being open to change are more ready to kind of embrace agile and so on. But the people that you can see here aren't really just people; they are rather sort of organisations and cultural contexts. And actually, it can be very difficult if you're extremely busy, for example, and your organisation is kind of like hurtling along, to change the processes that you're using. This is a really difficult thing to do. Okay, so do agile processes always work? Are there some development projects that are better suited to agile methods than others? This is a question we can ask ourselves. Are there any situations in which agile methods might fail? This final one, is there any evidence that agile methods are more effective, is something we're going to look at next week. So I'm going to talk through some of the research that's been done in this area next week, so we'll save that until then. So one of the problems with a true agile process, if we're looking at it from the perspective of the manifesto, is that it requires buy-in from customers. And this is a major difficulty, okay? So we have a situation in the lab where mostly, if you come and talk to me or Rob or one of the TAs or someone drops us an email or something like that, we try to reply to it in a timely fashion and hopefully in a helpful way. If we don't do that, by the way, just email us again, right? So sometimes you kind of they just get lost in the scroll, but always feel free to email again if we don't get back to you quickly enough. So this is great because we're highly cooperative in this regard, but actually there are lots of situations in which that is not the case because people have to do their day job. So it's really time consuming having active user involvement, and a particular issue here is if that person is only informally involved in the project. So I'm sure everyone's had the experience of informally seeking advice from someone, right? So you will go and speak to, I don't know, so it might be a member of staff where you want a bit of information about something, or you want to say you think about doing a PhD and you go and have a chat to someone, or so this is fine, right? And the odd student coming and talking about these things, and hopefully staff always try to accommodate this, is no problem at all, right? And it's part of your job and it's good. But actually, if all students in the MSc course were to do that within a single week, it would just be completely overwhelming and unsustainable. And so actually, where you'll require some kind of regular contact and regular feedback, it's not really good enough to just say, okay, this person could here's your contact, drop them an email or phone them up or walk over to their desk every time you need some information, if they're trying to do something else, right? So a lot of companies where Agile is kind of employed properly in anger will always buy people out. So they will have, so ThoughtWorks tend to work in a way that they will have one of the customers within the organisation they're working with will sometimes move on to the project full time, okay, so they can provide that link. The other thing that's interesting to note about this as well is the frequent delivery of software is that actually you'd think this would be a good thing for businesses, but again, if they're not set up to be able to deal with that, it can be a problem. Okay, so they don't have, again, time every week to be providing feedback on this software. They sort of want you to go away and get on with it. And the other thing, of course, is that customers really need to understand the process. So it's hard to build flexibility into a contract. It's fine if everybody understands what's going on, okay, so you still have contracts when you have an agile project, but it's implied that there is flexibility in there, and that results in a better outcome for everyone, but people don't always perceive it that way. One of our guest lectures a few years ago, the company that came in said basically, whilst they try to employ agile processes themselves within the team, so they might use a Kanban board, for example, they might sort of iterate, have iterations, they never told the customer what they were doing, because the customer would be horrified, right? So the customer, in this case, a lot of the customers they dealt with, which tended to be SMEs within the Manchester area, who were spending money on something like a website, web application, right? That this was their first foray into this area. They're used to dealing with things like manufacturing contracts, right, which are fairly locked down before, they don't have to be, as we know from the first week, but often fairly locked down in terms of what's going to be delivered. And the idea that they would pay someone some money and not know exactly what they were going to get at the end of it and when exactly they were going to get it was just horrifying to them, okay? So it's really difficult, I think, to with some customers to kind of have that kind of relationship, because it's anathema to them. They sort of think, well, hang on, we have a chat about it, we write a contract, I go away and do my job, you go away and do yours, because we're too busy to do anything else, and then we just get on with it. Okay, so the other thing, which again I'm sure some of you will have some experience of working within this environment, and I'm looking forward to reading about your experiences in the reflective essay, is that it also requires buy-in from developers. And there are lots of different ways in which an agile project environment can be problematic if not everyone buys into it, okay? So having half the team buy in is a particular problem, because if the other half, one half of the team are buying in and they're doing everything they should be doing, and they're assigning themselves work and they're trying to self-organise it, and the other half is either trying to tell people what to do or alternatively not doing anything, this causes major issues. So I think the not doing anything is particularly problematic, actually, because the whole concept of self-organisation is that people should be kind of willing to engage and wanting to engage. And actually, the idea is that it's not top-down and it's not dictatorial. So if you've got somebody who's not doing anything, sort of philosophically within the agile mindset, you should not be going to them and telling them exactly what they should be doing. So managing that can be quite tricky. So you can have some kind of challenging situations there if you don't have everyone buying in. A lot of people don't feel comfortable with self-organisation. It can feel a bit weird, okay? They would rather have a responsible individual sort of overseeing things and telling them what to do. And this idea that, you know, the team would somehow work out itself what they were going to do is kind of a bit of an issue. Whole team responsibility is a funny one as well. So I have had conversations with students over the years about their worries about not contributing fully to the team. So generally speaking, in this course, we have most people contribute, okay? So most people engage, most people contribute, and they're kind of wanting to do a good job. Not always the case at undergraduate level, but we'll move on. So most of our undergraduates do as well, actually. So that's it's not fair to suggest otherwise. They're all very hardworking as well. But so certainly at master's level, people really want to do it right. Okay, you come to do a master's course, you want to engage, you want to do it right, you want to learn, which is good. And people will sort of be worried about the fact, well, I'm in this team where I'm working with somebody who's been doing this for like 15 years in industry, and actually I'm only just learning Python. This is and they're worried about this idea that they can't contribute properly to the team, and then that will affect their marks, right? And it will affect maybe what the team thinks of them. And the thing is, this is something that's very common to think about and completely understandable. Again, within the agile environment, if that individual is willing to engage, then this isn't a problem. Okay, so there are always going to be situations where you have differing levels of experience and so on. And whole team responsibility is about people working together to get the job done. So if someone's got a bug they can't fix, and someone else comes along, which is quite common, right? Because there's new pair of eyes on it, and just fixes it like that. Does not mean that the person who couldn't fix the bug there's a problem with. It doesn't mean anything like that. It just means that brilliant. We've within our process we've had someone else look at it, which is a good thing to do, and then we've managed to sort it out. So this is great. And it may be that some people are better at fixing bugs than others, but this is the way it goes. So it's whole team responsibility. Technical excellence. So again, this is something we will look at next week. So you, Rob, you're going to talk about technical practices, aren't you, that will are helpful within agile environments for kind of supporting this continuous delivery of software. It is the case that teams that are technically excellent, this is perhaps not surprising, tend to do significantly better within an agile environment. Okay, so there is some evidence that if you are a very experienced developer, you perhaps thrive more in an agile environment than you would do in a waterfall environment. But conversely, it can be harder for people who are not so experienced to they often kind of feel more comfortable in a waterfall environment. I would say that the technical excellence stuff is not just about being brilliant, but rather aspiring to improve. Okay, and I think those two things are related. And the other thing I think which is quite stressful for people is this idea of the frequent delivery of working software. I think once you kind of get over this idea that your software should always be working, it's okay. I think once you're so when the BBC came in and they talked about their kind of set up their environment where they're using sort of continuous deployment, they are. This is just how they work, right? This is how they've got a live system and they're updating it, and this is all fine, right? That's just how they work. But I think if you're working on building a new application, it can be quite challenging to have software that starts off working and continues to work all the way through, and that feels like quite a lot of pressure sometimes. So we also have, and I'd say more importantly actually, because I think these can be the real killers, organisational constraints. So there are a number of things from an organisational perspective we need to think about. So one of them is the company culture. Are people at the company willing to support this kind of activity, willing to let people change? Some people can feel very uncomfortable with some of the values that are incorporated within Agile. Another more mundane one is infrastructure requirements. Okay, so you need to, for example, have a continuous integration system really to do this properly. You don't have to. I mean, these aren't kind of like you can still run Agile without continuous integration as you are doing in your project. But within kind of if you're a software house, right, you need to have all of this set up. There is quite a lot of infrastructure that you might need. You need to make sure all your automated testing is working properly. So these days that is not so unusual, but there are still quite a lot of places where it doesn't really happen. And actually, if you are not I mean, it's amazing, this is true. If you're not if you don't have sort of good test coverage and a good automated test framework, then it's very difficult to really sort of maintain this continuous delivery of software and so on. So you need to make sure the infrastructure is in place. And if your code base doesn't have, so a good example is if you're working on a large code base, I think this applies to some banks actually, and you don't have a good test suite, making any significant changes to the way you run your projects is potentially really risky. Competing demands is a problem. So if you're in a sprint, it's particularly an issue with time boxing. If you're in a sprint and you've got somebody who just comes over and says, oh, we want you to do something different, we want you to do something else, this is very disruptive to the process. And of course, things like a high staff turnover can be a problem as well. So if you're constantly having people leave the team and come into the team, then that can be an issue. So there are also constraints that might be related to the software project. So one of them, computational complexity, we kind of looked at a little bit last week, and we sort of thought about it in terms of going on spikes for technical requirements or research stories where it's sort of computationally complex. But there are certainly situations where you are you're working on a project where you're kind of not quite sure where it's going to end up, okay? And there's a lot of work to do in terms of understanding the computational side of things. So this makes it slightly harder to kind of break down your stories into kind of sensible chunks and so on, because you're not quite sure what's coming next. So I mentioned competing demands. I think the other things which are quite interesting, which we haven't actually talked about that much yet, we often get questions about this, but we'll discuss it a little bit now, is related to things like system architecture and formally specified systems. So if you're doing something safety critical, for example, or you are kind of thinking about how your system should look, and we've talked about TDD and kind of, oh right, your architecture is driven by your tests and you're just building it up piece by piece. Well, is that always the right way to do things? Okay, there could potentially be problems with that. So Rob, do you want to say a little bit about architectures and?
Okay. So as Caroline's just sort of mentioned, it is relying on the fact that TDD is going to drive development, and therefore that the architecture of your system, should we say, rather than just single bits of software, is it really practical to rely on emergent architectures such as that to always be right? And if they're not, and you discover halfway through that you should have done something a bit differently, because some story parachutes in, and new story parachutes in, and now you've got to think about things completely differently. What do we do then? So let's just sort of like have a think about how we might cope with this sort of thing. So let's say we've got a system which is is more complex than just relying on just the code itself. This is quite common. Most things will have some sort of requirement of databases or other services. Now these other services could be internal. They could be things that we're going to write at some point, or we have written. They may exist, they may not exist. Or they may be services which are external to our organisation. And we might have things like sensors, so something which is providing data in some sort of live situation, which could be anything. So it could be a temperature sensor, for example. So how might we think about this? Well, so if we take an example, we use a concrete example to think about this. So say we've got to build an application that reads the local temperature, so that's going to be using a sensor. It's going to tweet the local temperature, so that's using an external service. And then it stores that temperature later for data analysis. So we've got all three of these things in our system.
Is that the kind of thing that might be useful in the Kilburn building?
What, keeping?
Yeah, tweeting the temperature to estates.
Well, it might. Yes, it might. Well, indeed, people have set up systems to monitor the temperature in various rooms and see how. Generally, it's people annoyed with how hot it gets, but
not me.
Not you. No. Anyway, so we've got an application which is going to do all three of these things, and so we might say, well, surely we should do some planning before we just start writing tests and writing code. And I would say yes, we probably should. And one of the things that one of the techniques that lots of people are starting to use these days, which has been around a while, was named for a while, is what's called a walking skeleton. And we've put a short blog post up in the in Blackboard about walking skeletons. If you tried to look at it earlier this week, it was a link, and it has disappeared from the internet. And I spotted that, and I've managed to find the blog post on the Wayback Machine on the Internet Archive. So I've now put a PDF up there, so it is there. And basically, a walking skeleton is something which provides the very it's even we've talked about MVPs, minimum viable products. A walking skeleton is even before the MVP. It is literally the minimum architecture required to sort of at least fake up the end-to-end story here. And the reason it's called a walking skeleton is because the reason it's called a skeleton is because you flesh it out with more features and more functionality and make it more robust as you go, so you add meat to the bones. And the reason why it's called a walking skeleton is because it must actually walk. It must actually do the thing, at least it must actually do or appear to do the things that you want it to do. So our walking skeleton for this situation might be that we set up a database for our data to be stored. We'll probably fake the temperature sensor when we're developing. We're not actually going to make every developer sort of like install a temperature sensor into their machine. I mean, how would that work in continuous integration? So we'd probably set up a piece of code to just maybe return a random number between, which would be a sensible temperature, maybe somewhere between 0 degrees and, well, for this country, what, 25? And what's the last thing? Oh, yes, the tweak. So definitely when we're developing, and certainly in continuous integration, we don't want to actually be tweeting, because for as much as anything, Twitter are going to notice that we're spamming it, and they're going to shut us down. So we'll set up some sort of place to just accept tweets, and it may be that literally all it does is just throw them away. And then our software in the middle, we'll set up the connections to these sorts of things, and that's our walking skeleton. So we've got a database, and that's probably the database that we'll use all the way through the development. Some of these things can be fairly close to what you'd expect it to look like at the end. But these two things, the temperature sensor and the Twitter link, we're definitely going to fake. And so this allows us to, right from the bat, then sort of look at that on paper, say, does this look like a sensible architecture? For the purposes of this, we'll say yes, that looks like a sensible architecture. We've got a database, we've got a sensor, and we've got our external service, and we've got this in a situation that we can run this code. We can, it's pulling a number, it's sending it to the fake Twitter service, and it's sending it to the database, and that's our walking skeleton. It does everything it's supposed to do, but it's not finished. And so then we'll go through a process of iteration. We will probably, to flesh out the Twitter thing, we'll probably actually have to, in a separate process, start to sort of poke at the Twitter API, see how it works, and then we might improve the way this is faked, in the sense that we might look at what Twitter would give us back if we sent a tweet, and so we'd make sure that this started to return that sort of information to us. And then at some point down the line, when we're happy that everything's starting to come into focus, then we'd actually sort of say, right, well, we no longer need this. We can actually sort of plug this straight into Twitter. But while we're testing and while we're doing continuous integration, we can have that look after it for us. And at some point, we'll have to actually test with actual sensors. But really, a temperature sensor is going to return fairly constrained information. So that's a walking skeleton. And as I say, the database may not change much. It may be that your initial sort of setup of the database is pretty much where it's going to stay. This is a fairly simple example, right? It's storing a load of times and dates and times and numbers. That's it. So that's a way you can avoid architecture having to be emergent with TDD. So you can iterate in your TDD process with that architecture already in place. Does that make sense? Okay, nods. Good. Okay, so as I say, do read the blog post that we've uploaded to Blackboard, because it gives a couple of examples where the walking skeleton really came into its own. More complex examples than I've given. Yeah.
These components in any software. This component should be in any software, not only this example.
Of course, yes. This is just a toy example. So the external. I just use Twitter as an example of an external API. It could be you could be sending locations to Google Maps or something like that. This is just a pure thought experiment, really. This is all like the simplest thing I could come up with, which involved all three of those examples. And there are probably other different things that one might need to connect to. They're the things I thought of off the top of my head. Okay, so the other thing that Caroline just mentioned that can be tricky is if we've got to formally specify our software. Should we stop here?
Oh no, you can't keep hanging for formally specified software. Come on, Rob. Let's go through this.
Let's push through this, and then we'll have a break. Okay. So there's this. For a while there was this sort of just an assumption that if you were building safety critical software, like air traffic control software or aircraft autopilots or nuclear power plant control software, that you just couldn't use Agile because there's this feeling that there's just too much uncertainty. Caroline mentioned even when you've got small to medium enterprises who want someone to build them a website, they get a bit jittery about not knowing exactly what they're going to get and when they're going to get it. So and I'm all for. Let me just assure you, I'm all for the aircraft autopilot software and nuclear reactor control software being really, really, really good. So there are certain things which you just have to have formal specifications. Can Agile be formal too? Well, one of the things we've always said about, we've mentioned a few times about the waterfall method, is that it locks you into a process by which, if you get into it and you realise something isn't quite right, it's very difficult to go back and fix that. And what Agile does is allow you to embrace change. Now, why can't we embrace change in a formal situation? Well, I think we can. So one of the things to remember with the Agile Manifesto, one of the things that Caroline sort of put up in the first week was this phrase: we value working software over comprehensive documentation. Now, this isn't saying we don't want any documentation. This is saying we like working software over comprehensive documentation. And when you're doing a project which doesn't need any formal documentation, that's great. You just do more. You're more to this side. But if you are working on a project that requires that everything be specified, and maybe you have to do some checklists, and you need to actually prove that the software is doing exactly what it is with documentation, then you can still do documentation to show that it's doing. Agile is not saying there's no documentation. Agile is saying that if possible, minimise the documentation. So we're basically saying that really one has to be pragmatic, and that Agile actually is fairly flexible and can cope with varying amounts of ceremony that you might require. So let's look at this sort of thing. So Agile is flexible, and how Agile is formed. So it's flexible. Use the right amount of ceremony. If the process you're following requires that you formally specify your software, and you formally prove that your software is doing exactly what it is, plan that in. It's part of your estimation. It's going to take this amount of time to write the software, and this amount of time to formally prove it, and this amount of time to document it. It just goes into your estimation. No one's saying you can't do any of that. Do the amount of work one needs to do to satisfy the official regulations. And Agile already has loads of formal stuff in it, in fact. So testing, if you're formally proving that your software works, then you're going to test it, and you're going to test it with high test coverage. And generally, although test-driven development is not something that all Agile projects will use, using something like TDD provides high test coverage at the code level. So that's already giving you some formality. You can use continuous integration to verify the formal requirements. You can actually have various other systems examining your code as part of the continuous integration step that you wouldn't necessarily do on your local machine because of time constraints of working in the in a sprint. But you could have other systems kick in and do all that for you. And one of the things that this formally specified software often requires is multiple views on the code, multiple people reviewing the code, both while running it and both while actually just examining it and sort of like checking line for line that things are sensible. And well, code review, while again doesn't have to be part of Agile, I mean it generally is part of Agile anyway in most processes. So either whether that's we've talked about doing pairing, and pairing may not be formal enough for writing nuclear reactor software. It may not be the only thing you want to do. You may pair, and you then may have another formal code review part of the process. Different people who haven't been part of the software team coming in and then examining your code line for line. Nothing in Agile precludes any of that happening. It can all happen as part of your sprints, as part of the process, and as part of being Agile. So it's certainly going to add some time to the length of time it takes to do anything, but that's what adding formal processes to any development style is going to do. Waterfall in a formal setting takes a lot longer than a non-formal setting. So I think you can do formal specifications in Agile. Any questions?
When you say formal processes, do you mean that we need to separate the processes and we acknowledge each one of them separately?
So you might do that. So you might have your development team sprinting, however you've decided to sprint, and they might hand off code at the end of each sprint to some other process which goes through and manually checks. It depends. All these processes. I mean, I've never written nuclear reactor software or aircraft control systems, but I'm aware they have processes and they will be different for each one, and there will be all kinds of formal checking that one has to do anyway. Whether the software is written in an Agile manner does not stop those processes from happening. They could be done as part of the process, or they could be done out with the sprints, but you can still develop in an Agile way, and it'll just depend on what the process requires as how it's how it's done. And of course that might then feed into the next sprint planning. So, okay, we've checked this, and we think there are these issues where the software, as you've written it, does not meet the formal specification. Go back and check. It's, in a sense, it's just it's more testing, I think. Okay.
Multiple review or pair programming.
Sorry, say again.
Multiple review of the code or pair programming. This is like a type of formality of.
Well, it might be, yes. So as I say, I've not worked in the formally specified project myself, but a lot of the processes that are used to formally prove that software does what it should be doing is done out with the development process anyway. So it's either done by people sort of literally printing the code out and going through it line by line, or it's some other tool is run over the code to show that everything's working as expected.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth just making explicit at this point that when we talk about formal specification, we're thinking about something which might be using model checking or set theory, or so it's where you've got your algorithms designed in a very specific way, and that's sort of the formal part. And then what Rob's talking about, so when we talk about process and formality, it's more formal specification means that your algorithms need to look a certain way, and then you're talking about the stuff that goes over the top, aren't you?
Exactly. Yeah. So whatever these standards are, the ISO standards, or they'll be equivalent EU standards, or whatever. There'll be some specific standards body somewhere which will detail the sorts of things that need to be checked. And I'm saying that this can either be fitted into the agile process as people are working, or you might just run it as a separate process out with that, and that's pretty much how it would work in waterfall anyway. So okay, right, so 10 past.
Let's make a start. So we have talked about some of the reasons that it might be tricky to use agile processes, but I think another interesting reflection, for those of you who deal with software engineering bloggers on the internet, you may be well aware of some of these issues already, but one of the problems, one of the criticisms that is often levelled at proponents of agile is that actually agile practices can be really restrictive. So we're talking about embracing change and stuff like this, but actually the practices can be really rigidly applied and very restrictive. And people who are into agile can be really dogmatic about it. This is the only way that you should develop your software. If you don't use XP or you don't use Scrum or whatever, then you're doing it wrong. And obviously this is not what we are suggesting as part of this course unit, but it is out there. Okay, it is out there. So you do have people who are paradoxically very dogmatic. And I think there are elements of the agile movement that sort of promote that as well, right? I think culturally this is definitely an issue. So I think thinking about something like test coverage is interesting. So most people will accept that you don't want like 100% test coverage, because A, it's actually not that meaningful. Right? So it still doesn't mean that your tests are amazing, but also you could spend all of your time writing tests when actually there are some situations where it's just not, you don't need 100%. So dogmatism in any form is problematic, and if you have a situation where you have your daily scrum and it must be exactly 2.5 minutes and everybody must be standing up and blah blah blah, it's kind of like people can get rubbed up the wrong way by this, right? So, and it's something that people aren't always very happy about. So I've called this alternative approaches to Scrum. So what I'm not going to talk about is some of the more traditional approaches to Agile because I think they're quite well documented. You can kind of read about those in your own time if you wish. Scrum is a good example of a still widely used kind of programming methodology. It's probably one of the most widely used. So I thought I would talk though about alternatives that people use that are less rigid. Okay, so XP is arguably more rigid than Scrum, certainly as rigid, I think. Whereas something like Kanban is not. So you're using a version of Kanban to organise your stories within your sprints because you're using a Trello board. And the idea of Kanban is you basically have your columns and you move stories out of the to-do list into the current or active or in progress list, and then you move them to the done list. So we talked about this before. And the thing about Kanban is that you can use a Kanban board for organising your work, but actually lots of people use the Kanban methodology where you just continuously do this, right? So you don't have sprints, you don't worry about that, you just do the work, right? So you break it down into small stories and you move each one through, and you have some method or process for kind of like integrating and delivering these things, and then you just carry on, right? So it's just a continuous process. You don't need to kind of time box things. So that is one alternative, which allows a little bit more flexibility. So I think with Kanban versus Scrum, firstly, there isn't necessarily a distinct, it's not competition between them. I think the kinds of situations in which it is useful to use Scrum is when you kind of have a deadline for delivery and you're trying to kind of manage the process such that you kind of are managing risk. So taking these regular breaks to evaluate what you're doing, to evaluate whether you're likely to meet the target and so on is helpful. Kanban is sensible for something like dealing with issues, right? So if you're pulling stuff off an issue tracker, you don't necessarily need a sprint to be able to do that, right? So it could be in that kind of situation that you just kind of continue going through. So we talked a lot about planning and estimation, and we've emphasised how important planning and estimation are, and blah, blah, blah. And there is a school of thought, actually, that there might not be any point in doing an estimation, because if you have got some things that need to be done, you've got some software that needs to be built, so you know that it needs to have all of this functionality, then why not just build the software, right? Why estimate how long it's going to take you? You've just got to do it, and any time you spend estimating it is going to be wasted, because you're still going to do it anyway, right? So this is another way of thinking about it. So there is a document that's available online, Speedy Lightweight Agile Planning, which is, I put a link to it there. I suggest you go away and have a look at it to explain about it in a little bit more detail. What this says is basically you start off, you do have some planning, right? You can't get away from any planning at all, otherwise how would you know what you're building? So you start off with your stories or whatever, and then you separate them into two piles: the stuff that has to be done and the stuff that makes the stuff that has to be done better, right? And you just do the stuff that has to be done, and if you have any time left over, you do the stuff that would make the stuff that you have to do better. That makes sense, doesn't it? Right? Read the document. But the point is here is if there's something you've got to do, you just do it, you don't estimate, and everything else, all the bells and whistles, you leave until later on, and you do those next, if you have time. So I think that's quite an interesting approach. There is another version of this, which is for those of you who use profanities, which I think is actually quite effective. But I put the link to the polite one, so so we'll maintain everyone's dignity at study and work. Okay, Agile Light. Cool. Can we get lighter than Agile? Well, we can do Agile Light. So Agile Light is another interesting, I'm still not convinced that the title is completely reflective of what it does, but this is basically saying that conceptually, this idea of continuously delivering working software and having sprints is actually quite draining mentally, okay? And as I've said before, there are ways of organising things where that isn't the case. But this explicitly acknowledges that. And so what it suggests is you have basically 4 weeks, 4 weekly cycles, and one of those weeks is spent just on planning, and you don't have to use the whole week for planning, so you can do other stuff instead. They suggest going surfing, I think. I don't think that's going to work in Manchester, but you know, something else. So this is about avoiding burnout. So I think what this is saying is that it's recognising that implicitly within the idea of sprinting, right, because it's called sprinting, you know, there's this idea that people are going to be working really hard and getting their heads down, and it's going to be, you know, we're going to be panicked and we're going to have to kind of get loads of stuff done. And it's saying, actually, people can't do that indefinitely, because you can't. So actually what we're going to do is have 3 weeks on, 1 week off. Okay. So this is another alternative way of looking at it that I think is quite interesting. So, developing with agility then is what we're aiming for. So, remaining flexible and open to change, not just in terms of requirements, but obviously in terms of practices, and adopting practices that work within the constraints of the project and suit the composition of the team. So that's, I think, what we're ultimately aiming for. So, it's good to talk. In Agile, we value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, customer collaboration over contracts negotiation. Okay, so we know this, right? This has been drummed into us, and we're aware that we need to communicate with our team, and we're aware that we need to communicate with customers. And there are good reasons for this, okay? Because written documents cause us to suspend judgment, and they can stop us from iterating over meaning. They also decrease whole team responsibility. Okay, so there are lots of reasons why we'd want to talk about this stuff and communicate about it, rather than having everything written down and assuming that we understand what's actually going on. Of course, we still need to document requirements, and we still need to plan. And the way that we've been doing that is by using user stories. So we've got the Connextra formats that you can see here. As a role, I want a goal, so that reason. So a lot of you are still using this in your product backlog. So as a job seeker, I want to upload a CV as a PDF document so that I can get my work experience online more quickly than if I filled in a form. And we can also have imperatives as well. So we've got some of these as well as examples. Allow CV upload as PDF. And whether the version that you want to use kind of depends on the context. So that's fine, and that's kind of, if this prompts us to talk to the customer, which is a good thing to do, but unfortunately it can also lead to a certain amount of ambiguity. And one of the things we really need to do when we're working with customers is pin down what they actually mean. So one of the things we've done here in terms of the way we've supplied data to you is we've used a version of specification by example. Now this is a formal software engineering approach, and we haven't implemented the whole cycle. But I think that the useful part of specification by example is this idea that as a customer you can provide information to a developer in a form that allows them to be certain about what they should be doing. So it doesn't mean we don't still have a chat about the edge cases, it doesn't mean any of that, but it means actually where we identify an edge case, say, oh, could you give me an example of that? Could you tell me, if this thing happened, what you would want the outcome to be? And we have tools that people can use. So they're basically spreadsheet-based tools where customers can actually put in input and output values, quite user-friendly, and developers can use them for going away and then developing their own tests. So this is one way that as a software developer we probably find quite appealing, that allows us to work better with users, with customers. So it's not always possible to access users directly. So I talked earlier on about the fact that people are often very busy and it can be difficult to talk to the right people, and if the company you're working with isn't prepared to give you access to exactly the right people because they're busy doing their day jobs, then you have to use someone else. So alternatives might include a customer. So a customer obviously can be different to a user. So it might be that the user is somebody who is going to be providing data, inputting data. It might be a salesperson or something like that. Whereas the customer might be the managing director of the company. Okay, so you could talk to the managing director. But the problem is, if you do that, they might not really understand what the end user is going to be experiencing, and this is very common. So you see across organisations all the time. Certainly something that we experience within the university. So we have people making decisions at one level and doing that, with the best interest of everyone, kind of at the centre of that decision. But because they don't do the job day to day, actually it's very difficult for them to always make a correct decision. So we try to involve people lower down if we can. So that's one of the issues with the customer. You might have a situation where a development manager is kind of working as a user proxy. Issues with this include them really thinking about it from a software perspective and not an end user perspective. So they're going to think about it in terms of what's best for the software project and not necessarily what's best for the end user. A former user can be helpful, so somebody who used to do the job, but unfortunately they lack that investment, moving forward. So they might have some ideas, but perhaps not giving it the attention to detail that they would if they actually had to use the software in the end. And a BA actually isn't a bad one. So business analysts are trained to understand what people want and then communicate that to software developers. So that's kind of their job. So it's like a product owner in Scrum. Product owners are often business analysts, trained as such. So that can work quite well. It still doesn't substitute for being able to ask the question of the end user. So one of the rules here is that if you can't directly access the end user, you can't do that frequently, then you want to try to mix up the types of people that you're talking to if you can. So you don't just get the managing director view, and you don't just get the development manager view, and you don't just get the former user view. Okay, so
excuse me.
Yeah.
Why should I be concerned with user process? Because it's out of my hand. It is the organisation themselves who assigned that man to this particular job.
Yeah, okay. So I think I'm talking to you not as a software developer who's just working on a project, but as the leader of your agile software development company in the future. You need to think about this as someone who's in organisational terms, that it's important to understand these things. Does that make sense? Yeah, I agree with you that as an individual software developer just working within a team, you might not have options. But if you do have options, these are the kinds of things you should think about. And when you're running your own team, these are also the things that it's important to bear in mind.
Sorry, in worst case scenario, as a leader of my agile team,
Yes?
if they gave me the wrong guy,
Well, you'd use all your diplomatic skills to explain to them, actually, it would be great if we could talk to this person instead. How can we make that happen? Would it be possible to arrange a meeting at this time? Yeah. I haven't got time for that in this lecture, but we're putting a diplomacy lecture and dealing with customers. And maybe I'll extend that for next year. Okay, so we've talked about this from kind of a dry software development perspective, and I've given you this kind of high level about how we should get the customer to supply us with tests and this kind of thing, which is all good, and this is what we want. But we also need to think about why we're doing this and think about strategies for doing it. So, what this clip art, circa 1992, is trying to communicate to us is that when you have a system, we've got a system here in the middle, not quite sure what it does, you've got people on different sides of it. So they could be two different users, they could be two different developers, they could be a developer and a user, they could be anyone else within the organisation, and they have very different views of that system. So it might look red or it might look blue, and it's the same system, but we've got these two people with completely different views of the system. So obviously this matters, so we can see that it matters that people might have different views of the system. But what's it mean for us as developers, and how we need to think about the development process? So there's a PDF that I put in Blackboard that provides an interesting view on this particular issue. So it's talking about the use of user stories and persona stories within Agile planning. So I'll leave you to read that. But one of the things it does is talk about the kinds of skills that individuals have. So you have something called a systemizing quotient. And this is about your analytical ability, right? So everybody, I guess people have heard of IQ, so your general intelligence, right? So we can break this down into lots of different things. So systemizing quotient is how good you are at analysing and understanding systems, okay? Empathizing quotient is how good you are at understanding other people and being able to see things from their perspective. And there is a really nice graph in that paper. So can I take that off, or should I do it on there? And maybe I'll do it on here. Okay. So there's a nice graph in this paper. There are quite a lot of graphs actually looking at this online. Where if you've got your quotients going up here, okay, so that's kind of your normalised quotients, and you've got your interest in technology over here, okay. So the further along here you are, the more interested you are in technology. So this is another thing. There are like psychological tests for everything. So you can formally define what someone's interest in technology is. So this is technology down here, and this is people here. So if you're kind of here, that's not really in the middle, but let's assume that's like the middle, okay, right? So we have kind of somebody who's interested in both people and technology, and then we've got someone who's interested in people, someone who's interested in technology there. So what you tend to find is, and this is for men, so the situation is slightly different for women actually, which I'll come to, but when they've done this with men, what they've found is where people are interested in technology, this may include software developers, their systemizing quotient goes like that, right? Well, it doesn't go quite like that, but thereabouts. And what we find, what do you think we find with the empathizing quotient? What direction does that go in? Anyone care to guess? Yes, thank you. Right, so empathizing quotient, again, I'm approximating, basically goes like this. So as men become more interested in technology, they become less interested in people. So interesting for women, the situation is slightly different in that their systemizing quotient goes up as they become more interested in technology, but they appear to retain the ability to understand people as well to a greater extent. I should also say that there are men and women all over the place, right? So it's not about whether you're male or female. Lots of people fit into this in different buckets, but it's kind of interesting to just look in general terms about what we might find here. So, why is this an issue for software engineering? Okay, so you've got people who are building systems who are very interested in the technology, less interested in people, less understanding of people. Is this a problem? Yeah?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily? Why is it not necessarily?
Because we have to build the correct process of utilizing everyone.
So, you can fit people into that process. I agree with you about that. I also think that process, though, is the way of dealing with it as well in a slightly different way, in the sense that you obviously want to play to people's strengths. So if you've got somebody who is less good at interacting with people, you probably don't want to lose a product owner, right? So I would definitely agree with you about that. So you play to people's strengths. I also think, though, that the nature of the agile process is really good at dealing with this issue of not understanding people, because what we do is we don't assume everyone's going to be brilliant at it. We just build into the process the fact that you need to go, so we formalise this process of having discussions almost. We formalise this process of needing to communicate. So we don't say, oh, you should have a chat with the user if you feel like it, because most people won't feel like it. You say, you've got to go and talk to them, right? There's no option here. And I think this is true of software development generally. I mean, I know some people have experience working in the industry, and one of the things that's very interesting that often happens, we have our first years come in, sort of 18, and they might, if they've done computer science at A-level, they might have had some experience of working with other people, but often haven't. And they want to sort of work late at night on their own in the dark on their computer doing their programming, and this is their preferred kind of method of operating. Oh, this is fine, and this has yielded good results up to now, so it's fine. But the problem with that is that it's just not how it works in the real world, and we know that we've got to kind of have good communication in there, and for the people who find it more challenging, it's a really good thing to have it built into the process. So this is something that's very good. One of the things that's really good about Agile is this building into the process. Something else actually which I think is interesting, and I wanted to raise it because it's a common fallacy. I think it's useful for people in this room who've made pieces themselves on one side or the other to reflect on, is introversion extroversion. So this is slightly different to empathising. So if you are an introvert, and again this is quite common I think for people who work within software development who are introverted, it means that spending time with people drains you. Okay, it doesn't mean you don't like to do it, it doesn't mean that you don't want to have friends and things, but it means that you're not one of those people who'll go into a room full of strangers and go, yeah, I'm in my elements, and just work the room and kind of walk around talking. And, right, so this is not something that introverts typically find particularly enjoyable. If you're an extrovert, you love spending time with people, and actually you get really drained if you're not with people. Okay, you want to be there, you want to be chatting, you want to be talking to people, and so there's this kind of introversion extroversion scale. And people who have more technical jobs tend to fall more on the introverted side. But the thing that I wanted to draw out, which I think is very important, is that there's this perception, if you are introverted, you are not good at understanding other people, okay? And this is actually not true. So one of the really interesting pieces of research that's been done in the last few years looking at this found that actually introverts are often more sensitive to other people in terms of their reactions and so on than extroverts are. And this is probably one of the reasons they're introverted, right? Because from an energy perspective, if you're actually quite perceptive and responding to other people and commonly worrying about what the other person is thinking and all of this kind of stuff, and you find that actually it uses quite a lot of energy, then, and whereas extroverts kind of, well, they don't care, they just carry on, right? Have a good time, and why worry about it? So I thought that was kind of worth talking about as well. So I think reflecting on ourselves and how we might feel about things and trying to sort of understand that, I think, is always quite important too. So anyone care to guess so I don't know actually what the most introverted profession is. I think it's quite, I'm not sure about that. Anyone care to guess what the most extroverted profession is though? What group of people score highest, some way above actually everyone else on the extroversion scale?
Sales assistant.
They are high, but they're not the highest.
Human relations.
No, I don't. I'm not sure whether
Marketing.
they spend all their time sacking people, though, don't they? So, yeah. Marketing, yeah, again, high.
People in art.
No, it's not. So yeah, I think sometimes. Well, I think with art, it's a funny one. So you get some very introverted and some very extroverted. Yeah.
Management.
Well, management's all over the place as well. You get a wide variety of people in management. No, it's hairdressers. So it's people who spend all day talking to themselves in the mirror, basically, when they have something in front of them. But anyway, yeah, so hairdressers, there you go. So any raging extroverts in here, that is the job for you. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay, right, so let us move on. You're going to work the computer.
So which one is it you need now? This one.
Yeah, I'll do reflection. Yeah.
I'll just start you there.
Okay, right. Okay, so in the last part of this lecture today, I'm going to talk about reflection. So I'll talk about it in a couple of ways. Part of this will be talking about the essay that you have to do, because I know that will be something that people are keen to learn about. But I'll also talk about the process in a bit more generally. Okay, so what we'd like you to do in the project is explain clearly and concisely. So we will look at the structure of what you write, and if it's understandable, that will improve your marks. With examples, so we want you to try to be specific if you can. I'll give you some examples in a second. What went well? What didn't go well? and how you tackled problems. So basically the remarks associated with all of these, so the remarks associated with, are you able to describe what happened in a sensible way? Are you able to explain what went well? Are you able to explain what didn't go well? And are you able to explain your approach to tackling issues, right? So for all of you sitting there thinking, we did, you know, I can talk about what went wrong, but you will all have had experience of problems and tackling them, right? It's just you have to sort of get your head around how you need to approach this. So, of course, this is all about your agile mindset that you have been acquiring over the course. So, what does that mean? You experience something. You think about what happened. You then learn from that situation because you're kind of analysing what happened, and you think, maybe it was this thing. And then you adjust your approach according to what you believe you've learned. So you kind of hypothesis testing at this point. So, for example, if you get to the bus stop in the morning and the bus has already gone, it's sailing off into the distance, you might think, I left the house too late. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the house 5 minutes earlier tomorrow morning. So you've adjusted your approach, and hopefully in that situation you get on the bus. If the same thing happens again, you may have to then iterate over that, think about it. What I'm going to try doing next time is going to bed earlier than 4 o'clock in the morning, and that way I might get up in time to get on the bus. You know, this kind of stuff, okay? So let's have a look at, so these are real life reflections from some of our former students on their experience of pair programming. So this is one of the things that you might want to think about reflecting on. So this student says, during the project we tried to vary the pairs as much as possible. So this was actually with a team of 5, I think, rather than 3, so you're more limited with 3. Although it took us out of our comfort zone, it also helped a lot as we got to know each other better. So in this case, they're reflecting on something that went well for them. So they were saying, actually, we weren't sure, we were a bit unsure about this, a bit worried about it, but there was a degree of discomfort there, but actually we realised in the end that it was a good thing to do because it helped us to get to know each other better. So this is another student. At first, working in pairs felt intimidating. It was odd to have someone looking at you as you wrote code. I do sometimes wonder, actually, with the whole pair programming thing, that one of the issues is less somebody looking at the code you've written and more somebody looking at you write code. Anyway, I think you know what I mean by that, don't you? Yeah. Anyway, then we realised that by working in pairs we were less likely to waste time surfing the web or checking our phone because our partner was waiting for our contribution. This kept us focused on the task, which was particularly useful when we had a difficult problem to solve. The most predominant benefit of pair programming is sharing of knowledge. I didn't have much experience with Python, but I was able to learn quickly from my more experienced partner. During the Easter break, it was almost impossible to apply pair programming because two of the team members left the country for 3 weeks. So this was when it was, this was when it was in the second semester, and we used to have an interruption in the middle of the course. We tried to continue to use pair programming using GitHub, Google Docs, TeamViewer, and even Skype. However, due to the time difference, these techniques were applied just a couple of times. Our experience was that to get the best out of pair programming, you really need to be in the same room. So this is a really nice one for lots of reasons. So basically what they've done is they've tried something, they've seen an issue, they've adjusted their approach several times, they've learned each time that it still doesn't really work properly, and their final kind of reflection on this is that actually they just found it really difficult without being in the same room. So they're not negative about it, okay? So one of the things that when you're thinking about kind of more formal reflection is you want to try to avoid negativity. You might have had a really terrible experience, okay? So this doesn't mean you won't have negative experiences. You might have really struggled in one way or another. But actually you want to try to draw out the positive from that particular experience. So you may have had a real difficulty organising your team to begin with. You may have had people not engaging, whatever. And really what you want to try to do in this situation, which is hard to do at the time, but is try to sort of take a step back and say, okay, what really was the problem? Was it that this person didn't respond to emails? Was it that we maybe didn't send enough emails? What have we learned from this? Well, it might be we've learned that you really need to have someone, turn up when they say they're going to, and this is a reasonable thing. But your reflection on that is the importance of timeliness, the importance of being engaged, rather than this is a terrible person and I have a vendetta against them and I'm going to make sure that anyway. Yeah. So it's looking at it from a positive perspective. So that's an important part of this. Rob, can you give me any examples of where you've reflected more formally and then improved your approach?
So very early on in my experience of TDD, I used to get very bogged down in actually doing it quite dogmatically, especially at the start of a project. And I talked about this a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about TDD and said, well, what do you do at the start when there's literally nothing there? And I worried about this for a while, and it stopped me from doing stuff. So I basically decided. So I reflected on that.
Did you? Good,
yeah.
Excellent.
And decided that I wouldn't be so dogmatic about doing TDD. So I like TDD, and I would always encourage people to use it where they can. But really, there are times when it is more pragmatic to not do TDD, and so the change in my approach is that if I spot myself struggling to actually conceptualise how I'm going to do something in TDD, I no longer worry about it.
So you just don't do TDD at that point?
Not at that point, yeah. I'll get a bit further into it and then maybe write tests in retrospectively, and then restart TDD when I'm doing something which better works.
Yeah. You can't see the expression of the people behind you actually when you said that. Yeah, well, you can all reflect on your experience of TDD from that perspective. Then there you go. That's something to go on.
It is okay to bend the rules if it is going to help me along the way.
It's important to be pragmatic about it.
Yeah.
If following some dogmatic process is actually hindering, then you shouldn't.
But sometimes it is not that that the process is dogmatic. Sometimes I lack the experience, so I think it is dogmatic, but why it's not? This is what I faced, for example, last week. Right.
Okay. So fair enough. I suppose the thing I sort of found was that it was actually genuinely. It was both slowing me down and also causing me misery. To some level of misery, and actually trying to follow this process. And when I sort of, and I hadn't even caught myself doing it, and once I caught myself doing it, I just basically decided that, well, if I can't do something easily in that sense, I can always come back to it later, but I don't have to push through and force myself to do something which actually isn't working. So.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so just quickly, what sorts of things then do you think you might reflect on? So you don't need to give me any kind of particular experiences in your team. What sorts of things, have caused you problems within TDD? That always comes up. Yeah, that's a good one, right? So this comes up every year. Okay, so TDD has caused you some challenges. That's excellent. Anything else?
Treble programming.
Pair programming?
Treble programming.
Treble programming. Oh, so you're doing your team all together. Okay, so that's interesting. So could you compare that with working by yourself or working in a pair or whatever? Yeah, so that might be an interesting thing to do. Any other thoughts about the kinds of things that you might?
Variance and skills.
Variance and skills. So people in the team having different levels of skill. Yeah, absolutely. That's something to think about. Yeah.
Different schedules because you have different courses.
Different courses, yeah. Causes problems with getting people together, different schedules.
Self-organising in general.
Self-organising in general. Are you thinking about your team or yourself?
Yeah, the idea that the whole team is self-organised.
Yes. Yeah. So absolutely. So this could be a major challenge in terms of trying to get when you've got a bunch of students who maybe haven't worked in that kind of way before. It can be quite a challenge to manage it. Do you feel that your team has improved over the?
Well, we spend a lot of time on just getting all in those things.
But I think that's okay. Right? I think okay.
Maybe
But
not too much.
right. Okay. I'll leave you guys to have that out later. But the thing, but the point is, stuff like this can be really time-consuming, though. I think, and so I guess it's sometimes that's just how it goes. It's so easy. I get to the end of pretty much every day thinking about how much time I have wasted today not doing any work and just talking to people instead. You feel like that, don't you, as well? You might have been wasting time talking to me, I don't know. Anyway, but you know, but it's so easy, but actually a lot of that can be a part of the process as well. Does that?
Sure.
It feels at the time like it's kind of unavoidable as well. But anyway, I look forward to your...
some kind of hierarchy might not have been about.
Yeah. Well, yes, but that's fine though. So think about that. Think about what you've learned from it and what that might mean in terms of how you think things could be better organised in the future. And because the other thing is, of course, one thing you absolutely can reflect on is you can be critical about the process. You can be critical about the fact that this was the way the course unit was run, in the sense that so you're supposed to be doing Scrum, but actually, are you really doing Scrum? Okay, you know, can you really adopt these roles of kind of product owner, Scrum Master? You know, so it's fine to talk about that as well. So all I'm asking of you when you do this is you try to do it in a positive way, and that means you can say very negative things. But what you want to do is say, from this negative event, actually, we've learned this positive thing, hopefully. Yeah. Good, excellent. So, does that make sense? Yeah.
There's a certain level to which, and this is often a reflection that people have on this course. There's a certain level to which it's a false environment.
Yeah.
You know, it's 3-person teams. It's you know, as Caroline said, we're sprinting with Scrum, but you've only got limited time to do it, and that sort of thing. So these are all worthwhile things to think about when you're reflecting.
Yeah. So the assignment itself, deadline's on Friday the 13th, because who doesn't like a deadline then? At 6 o'clock. And it's in the final teaching week. So if you're someone who has an automatic extension, you'll still get that extension. The submission will be marked as late, but I know who to remove the late flag from, so don't worry about that. Yes, so I was saying earlier on, so I think some people were under the impression there would be a sprint into the final week, but we don't. So this week is the final sprint, and then the week after that we want you to sort of focus on the essay instead. We found that if you have a sprint, people don't do anything on the essay, or vice versa, so just that wasn't working. It was a reflection for us, you see. We reflected on that and we realised there was a problem, so we changed it. It shouldn't take you all week though, right? So you've got this week, but you'll have your other course unit, obviously, and so we don't expect you to spend all week on it. Please don't do that and produce some tome. We're kind of thinking about a much shorter document. So to put it in context, you used to do this in the exam, where you'd have about an hour to do it. You're free to spend longer than an hour if you wish, but it's sort of, 1,000 to 1,500 words maximum. We don't specify the word limit. You can do less than that, or you can do more than that, but we don't need like 18,000 words on this. It's kind of save that for your project. It shouldn't take you a week. Okay, right. So, does anyone have any more questions about that?
Sorry, I didn't hear. Did you mention the word limit?
There isn't a word limit. Okay, and the reason I haven't put a word limit on is because people have different writing styles, and these are often. So at this stage of the course, once you get to your project, hopefully things have settled down a bit. These are often culturally bound writing styles, so I don't want to kind of be really restrictive about the number of words, but we would expect people to do between 1,000 and 1,500 words maybe, but that's just a very ballpark. If you do less than that, people have got distinction level marks by writing much less than that, but it's hard, a lot of people can't do that, it's hard for them, so that's kind of what we're looking at roughly. Oh yes, and you'll get feedback for this before, so the university closes over Christmas, but you'll get feedback for this before you start your exams. So the aim is to give you feedback on this, which, because for some of you it might be relevant to the exam if there are any misunderstandings of concepts or anything. We'll do that at least a week before your exams, so it'll be early January. We'll aim for the first week of January, but it should be within the time period to give you feedback on that. So. Okay, Right, so what we'll do is we'll take another break.
So let's get started again. So what we thought we'd do now is to actually run through an example of how one might organise an agile project. So it's going to be a sort of a slightly interactive session. So apologies to those introverts.
No, everyone loves it.
Oh right, okay, good. Right, so we're going to sort of put a sort of software product sort of out there, and we're going to put some stories to it, and we're going to give you some constraints as to sort of what sort of numbers of people you've got to work on this, and then in sort of groups of a few people that hopefully will sort of self-organise, maybe 4 there and 4 there, and I don't know, let you self-organise. We'll discuss various different ways one might organise what we're going to give you in terms of an agile project, and it's going to be agile in the sense that we're not going to give you all the information up front, and we're going to change the rules as we go, and see how that changes what people are thinking. Okay, so we're going to. You have been tasked with producing an office suite, so fairly standard. It will initially comprise just a word processing application and a slide presentation application. So we don't have to worry about spreadsheets or anything else. So an office suite with two parts to it to begin with. We have 12 developers, and we're going to assume that all the developers have similar levels of experience and technical expertise. So you can assume that either all of the developers have worked on Office software before, or none of them have. They're all sort of similar level, and they're all fairly technically. They're all fairly technical level as well. Okay, so the first question, I suppose, is then with that as being the only information you have, how would you organise the developers? So if you just sort of have a conversation with the people who are close to you, either on a row or if you're on a row on your own, turn round or whatever, and just come up with an idea. Given that's the information you've got, how would you organise the developers? I'll give you, what should we say, a couple of minutes? Okay, that's quite a few minutes, everyone. So, 2 applications within, sort of linked, probably, in the sense that they're part of the same Office suite, and 12 developers. So, how do people arrange the developers? Should we start at the front? What was your strategy for arranging the developers?
So because there's 2 projects in a sense, so we're creating the word processing application and the slide presentation application. So since the developers are on similar levels of experience, we split it into just half and half for now. So 6 developers on one team.
Right.
And 6 on the other.
Okay, so this team at the front has said we've got 2 applications, we've got an even number of developers, and they're all the same experience. Why don't we just put them into 2 teams of 6? That sounds perfectly reasonable to me. Did anyone else go for that strategy? So your team went for that, you went for that. So who didn't go for 2 teams of 6? Right, so what did you go for instead?
We'd have to do the agile process and estimate how difficult or assign points to each thing. So if Word has more points than slide, then you wouldn't divvy up the teams evenly, you'd divvy them up as opposed to the point.
Okay, so you're going to wait until you know a bit more about how complex each of the applications is until you allocate numbers of people on. Okay, that's interesting. No one in the 5 or 6 years you've been running this, no one's ever actually said that, so that's fine. I think that's good. I think that's perfectly fine. So we've got. Did anyone else have a different answer? Did anyone go for 1 team of 12? No.
That was also another one of our...
Okay, so that was a possibility. Yeah, and then of course that gives you the flexibility about moving people across stories, and there might be some shared stories. So that's interesting as well. So they possibly could be in one team, although I think 12 would probably be considered large for an agile team. And one of the things that has been coined as an example of how one might sort of limit the numbers of people in a team is this idea of having a 2-pizza team, which is, can you feed the team with 2 pizzas? Now, what size are the pizzas? I don't know.
It's 2-person team.
Yeah, exactly. So the thing is that I don't know. It was probably someone from the US who came up with this, and I've seen some of the pizzas you can buy in the US, and they can be pretty big. But if you imagine the idea of some sort of like, you know, a couple of large pizzas from Domino's, could you just get 2 of them and keep people sort of going over lunch? Then that might be an idea. So 12 might be considered quite high. Did anyone consider 3 teams? You did. Okay, two sets. So I'll start with the front. Why did you go for 3 teams?
Because I think this project is like something about Microsoft Word and Microsoft PowerPoint, right? Because, well, actually the Word and PowerPoint have some similar functions, like insert a table or make some spelling inspections.
Yeah.
So I will make a team that focus on this part, and well, the other 2 teams that focus on the specific function of the different two part of this project.
Okay, so the proposal here is that we have 3 teams, and that one's focusing on the functionality which is going to be shared between the 2 applications, like so both a slide presentation application and a word processor will want to have things like spell checking and insert tables, insert images, and that sort of thing, and then you'd have a team each to build these specific aspects of each application separately. Is that what you had thought as well?
Yeah, I just feel like the slides was better managed when there's like one functional lead for each of the team.
Okay.
They can communicate more accurately rather than working like. Yeah, you can also have split more responsibilities between them. You don't have to like. It's more exploration concerns, I think.
Okay.
More teams, which is better.
Right, okay, so very interesting. So you went for 3 teams as well, but for a slightly different reason, just a question of keeping them manageable and potentially more agile. Okay, fantastic. So that's all really interesting. I say no right answers, no wrong answers at this stage, because we've not really given you a lot of information. So I think that's really interesting. We have people thinking about 1 team, people thinking about 2 teams, people thinking about 3 teams, and people thinking about, well, let's just see what the work actually is going to entail before we. Yes.
I had a question. Would it be alright if we, let's say, have 1 big team but have like 6 pairs of people so we can all move around?
Okay, so you're proposing 1 team but pairing.
With 6
Okay, that's interesting as well. Yeah. Okay. So we have everything from 1 to 3 teams. I haven't missed anyone. No, did no one go for 4 teams? No. Okay, fine. Right. So let's not belabour this any longer. So that's really interesting. And as you can see, when you don't have all that much information, it's difficult to actually make any concrete decisions, and there's lots of things that you could do. So here we go. These are the first set of stories that we've got. We've got a product backlog, and we've got the following user stories on them. As an author, I want to edit text so that I can make corrections to my work. As an author, I would like to spell check my text to ensure there are no spelling errors. As an editor, I want to add images to documents to illustrate particular concepts. As a lecturer, I want to add videos to my presentations to make them more interesting. As a salesperson...
You should definitely do that.
Well, videos, yeah. As a salesperson, I want to add pictures of products to my presentation so customers can see what they look like. As a lecturer, I want to add bullet points to slides so people can use them for revision. That may have come from us. As an editor, I want to produce a table of contents so that readers can find a particular chapter. And the interesting thing about these stories are some of them sort of call out things like presentation, and some don't. Some are sort of a bit more, generically put. Okay, so at this stage, we'd like you to allocate the stories to your development teams, and if you like, you may change how you organise your teams at this stage, knowing this information. So I'll give you another few minutes to think about how you would deal with these stories, and think about how you might, whether there's similarities and whether there's dependencies and that sort of thing. So allocate teams, these stories to your teams, and you may change how you organise your teams if you want to at this stage. Right. Let's have a think about this. So, first question: did anyone change? Well, I'll start with the team at the back who hadn't decided whether we're going to use how many teams we're going to get. Have you managed to come down on a strategy for your teams now? Right. Yeah. What did you go for?
We went for 3 teams.
3 teams.
Yeah.
Okay. And why?
Because that.
For that reason. So generic functionality, word processor functionality, slide functionality. Okay. Has anyone else changed their thinking? Yes?
Yeah.
Everyone
Change
else?
from 2 teams to 3.
You've gone to 3 teams?
We're thinking like a front end and a back end.
Okay. A front end and a back end. So you're still at 2 teams?
Yeah, I guess, like different sort of areas.
Okay.
One that we probably might going to be split, but because it's the start now, everyone has to be aligned with the full scope of the project.
Okay.
Before split them, because everyone has the same experience, so we don't know how to divide them today.
So you're going to pull everyone together to begin with, get things started, and then when it feels like
we might split them in 3 different.
Okay. Right. That's an interesting strategy. Yes.
We used to have 3 groups, but when we distributed the task, it wasn't even.
Right.
Some group have 3, and one of them just got only one.
Okay.
So we are considering to make it, for example, 2, and
Right.
we exchange development between these 2 groups.
Right.
To work on the similarity between them.
Okay. So you've gone from 3 teams down to 2, and you'll.
We are considering. We didn't decide
sorry?
yet. Considering.
Oh, considering. Okay. Right. Okay. Okay. Fair enough. Okay. So that's interesting. So obviously we've thrown some more information into the mix, and you've now had a time to think about different ways of doing things, and it seems like most of you have changed your mind, which is natural given more information. So what did we think about the? So let's think about how we might distribute the stories. So which stories feel the most generic?
Edit text.
Add pictures.
Sorry?
Edit text. Edit text.
Edit text is generic, okay.
Spell check.
Spell check.
Spell check is generic. Any more?
Adding pictures.
Adding pictures, yep.
Table of content.
Table of contents, is that going to be generic? Do you have a table of contents in a slide presentation? Maybe not in the same way. We're adding videos. Probably not going to put that into a
No.
document. Not standard. Okay, so we've got, we think 1, 2, 3 are probably generic.
Yeah.
4 is slides only. So, did anyone spot any that are the same functionality? 3 and 5, yeah. So they're both adding images. So if you're adding images to, if you do that in the right way, you hopefully do that for both products at the same time. And what about 6? So 6 is an interesting one because it calls out the fact this is the person here is this lecturer is obviously thinking about the slide presentation, Do we consider that to be bullet points to be a generic functionality, or is it just for slides? It's probably generic. So it looks. So sometimes the stories look like they're for one application because of the way they're written, but actually, it doesn't take too much to think. Well, actually, we might want to add bullet points to a Word document as well. Okay, so we've got probably quite a lot of generic. With our balance of work is probably on the heavy side for the generic team, I would have thought. So I think those of you who've sort of been slightly cagey about how you're going to put people into teams are probably quite canny there. Okay, so in terms of, how about we think about team sizes? So those of you who've got your teams have got 3 teams. So I'll go with you guys at the back. Are all your teams the same size? No. So what are the general sizes of your teams?
8, 2 and 2.
8, 2 and 2. So you've got an team of 8 for the generic functionality, and a couple of pairs possibly for the specific functionality. Okay, has anyone else sort of done a unbalanced team structure? Yeah?
We've got
6-3-3. Okay, so same sort of idea. Okay, and of course the group who's decided that they're going to put everyone in the same team to begin with, and then see how it goes. We'll see how it goes. Okay. Any other thoughts anyone had about this at this stage? Okay, Caroline.
So, I think this isn't the exam question, but I'm going to sort of raise it anyway because I think it's helpful to think about this when we're kind of looking at how you do teams and so on. So we've got this Office suite, but we've also got products within that, and I'm thinking about ownership and how that works with the teams as well, because particularly if we have a team working on generic functionality and teams working on applications, which I think makes sense, by the way, so I'm not suggesting this is a bad way to do it, but I think they're also can potentially be, so who's in charge of done, for example, right?
Okay. So
within that structure, how do we factor that in?
So that's a really good question, and maybe what we should do then, in that sense, is say, because we've been talking about developers here, so the information I gave you is you have 12 developers. Okay, so why don't we take a couple of minutes, and everyone in their groups think about, if I were to say you can have X number of product owners, how would you do that? So you can choose to have as many product owners as you like. For your team, the way your teams are, and so let's just be fairly quick about this. It's a couple of minutes, and we'll think about what you might do with your product owners. Let's assume that each team has a Scrum Master, so let's not worry about that. But let's think about how you might structure the product owner hierarchy, if indeed you want to have a hierarchy for this. Okay, so just a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back and discuss that. So that's a couple of minutes. Let's see what people think about this. So how many groups went for a single product owner for the whole thing? Okay, so a group here. Anyone else? One product owner? No. Who went for 2? Okay, a couple of groups, 3 groups. Anyone go for 3? No. Okay, so do you think all of those are reasonable answers? 1, 2 or 3?
Well, so it depends on the rationale for it.
That'd be true.
Yeah.
So those of you, so you went for 1 product owner. Why?
We think that because there's similarity between both the systems, so one product owner should be responsible for splitting the task, and also estimating the effort for each task.
Okay, so and how many teams have you got your developers in? 3 teams. So you've got 3 teams of developers and 1 product owner. And your rationale for 1 product owner is because it's all similar enough that you want to have 1 single point of control.
As well as we don't have that many user stories if we think about it
Sure.
early enough.
At the moment, you
At
only
the
have...
moment, right now.
right.
So we're thinking about it like right now, at the moment, looking at the
Yes,
user
of course.
stories, and we feel that because there's not enough user stories, having another product
Okay.
owner could maybe even sometimes cause like a conflict between them two.
Right.
Because we're trying to organize these teams, and there's 2 people who are trying to manage it, and that could be a bit sometimes difficult in
Okay.
a sense. However, if it were to increase, maybe having another product owner could be helpful then.
Okay. Right, yeah, that's all perfectly reasonable. Right, so who went for 2? You went for 2, didn't you? So,
On mental level, we have 4 products,
right.
but we want to use 2 people to manage. One
So-
for the 3 of them and one for the 1.
Right, so what are your 4 products?
The internal, the Word, the slides, and one for the full scope.
Okay, so one at the sort of office suite level. And you've gone for 2 product owners.
Yes.
Um,
One for the only for the internals,
Yeah, oh right.
and one for the 3 for the other 3. And the reason that we wanted to put like this is because for the Word and for the slides, we want at first to have the same person in order to have for sure the same strategy and the same mindset, because it is the start and we want to have something similar, not something too extreme, something too different. We don't want any conflict.
Okay, so you've got, and how many teams, you're the one, you've
Yes.
still got 1 team, like you say. You've got 2 product owners, one to look after the internals, the generic stuff, and one to look after the office products themselves. Okay. So I think the only thing I would probably push back on there is that all the internals, although they are a significant part of this, they're still going towards building up the products themselves. So in a sense, one might not consider the internals to be a product in their own right, and you maybe only consider the actual finished, the Word application, the slide application, as the products. So it might be that having a product owner for the internals might conflict possibly with those product owners looking after the product as the user would see. Do you see what I mean? So that's a pushback I'd give. So that doesn't mean to say you're wrong.
Not if
That's
you make it
that's a worry I would have.
framework.
Sorry?
Not if you design the internal asset framework, which is utilized only by one user.
Okay.
This
So
makes hard work.
so you're suggesting that your internals, and I think you've kind of implied this actually with how you said it to begin with. Your internal stuff, the generic stuff, is effectively a product which the other applications are going to use. So you're going to do it that way. Okay. So I think that's. So I think so long as you sort of do think of it in that sense, rather than allowing a conflict to happen between the two, then you might get away with it. But I would probably just have a couple of concerns there. Did anyone go for 3 product owners? Yes. Why? Or how? How are they going to
So
operate?
on like for the Word, there will be
Yep.
one product owner for the slide, so
Yep.
and there will be one more who's for the overall scope.
Okay, so you've looked at it and said the Word application is a product, the slide application is a product, and the Office suite as a whole is a product. Okay, so I think that's probably not unreasonable. And also you give the ability to add another product owner in if suddenly someone comes along and says we should add a spreadsheet to this. You've already started to possibly have that flexibility as well.
So in that situation, would you consider it hierarchical?
Discussing that, I think we will have a consensus, so if a majority decides on the direction
Yeah.
they want to have.
Okay. Right. Did anyone have anything wildly different from any of that? Okay. Right. Okay. So let's add some more information into the mix now. Here's a load of extra stuff, and a lot of these are to do with the environment that we're dealing with here. So, of the 12 developers, 6 will be permanently co-located in the company office and 6 will be working remotely. We're not saying where they are remotely, they're just not in the company office. So they could be on the other side of the world, or they could be just, far enough away that they can't be bothered to come into the office. But they're not in the office. So we've got 6 in the office, 6 remotely. How might you use that information to allocate developers into your teams? Think about how the teams might communicate with the customer and with each other, and how should developers within a team communicate with each other. So give you another few minutes to think about that, and then we'll come back and discuss that. Okay. Let's have a think about this. We've now sort of added some physical constraints into this information. So we've still got 12 developers, but 6 are going to be in the company office and 6 are not. How do people allocate them to the teams? Did any group go for a fully remote team and a fully co-located team? No one. So did anyone go for splitting the co-located people and the remote people within teams? Most people went for that, did they? Okay. So, is anyone still at 2 teams? Yeah. How did you divide your developers across your 2 teams?
Well, we weren't entirely sure about the numbers first, but we definitely want to have someone permanently co-located in each team.
Yep. Okay. And why was that important?
Because then you always have them on hand. It's easy to have face-to-face.
Yep. So you're going to put 3 remote and 3 co-located in each team.
For example.
Yep. For example. Yeah. And that will allow the 2 teams, the co-located people in the 2 teams, to easily communicate, if needs be, in their co-location space. How do you think that so that covers how the team's going to communicate? Let's say, how do you think the teams should communicate within themselves? So with the remote people and the co-located people in each team, how should the team themselves communicate? Okay, so sort of like the standard online tools, video conferencing.
Yeah, like Skype. For instance.
Skype and Slack and
screen sharing.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, that seems perfectly reasonable to me. What about anyone with 3 teams? So you've got 3 teams now. So you were hedging your bets, right?
Sub teams.
Right. So you got 3 sub teams.
Yeah.
Okay. And how have you arranged them?
The 2 of them, which are for the slides and for the work, allocated in the company's office.
Yep.
And the rest of them remote.
Okay. Right. So you've got the people. So now just.
The people who are working for the external qualities allocated in the company's office, and the people for the internal.
Right, interesting. Okay, so you've said that the people who are working on the individual office products are going to be kept in-house, where you can see them and they can talk to each other easily, and people doing the generic stuff are going to be wherever they are. Okay, so what are the sorts of things that that might be advantageous for? So why did you go for it that way then?
Because they are from the same company,
Yep.
and they already know each other, so they already have experience on how to work together.
Okay. So
and, because the people who are working for the words and the slides, they are working in stuff that they are correlated with the external qualities of the product, which is what the client will see.
yes.
It is more important that they must be there.
Yes.
They must be on the office.
So you're saying that from the perspective of we've got our external clients, we've got our customers, and it's much better that our people who are interacting with them more are going to be in the company headquarters. Yes, so I quite like that. I think that's quite a nice way of doing it. Okay. Anyone got any wildly different? So you had 3 teams, didn't you, at the back? So how have you done your...
So we had it so if we had teams of 3, 3, 6,
Yep.
then you'd probably have one. So the 2 teams that are working on the specific functionality, you'd have one person from each of those teams to stay co-located.
Okay.
And then 4 from the generic functionality within the.
Okay. Right, and everyone else remote.
Yeah.
So you'd have 2 remote for each of the product teams and 2 remote for the generic team. Okay. Right. That would be interesting. Yeah, so again, there's no you're laughing. There's no wrong answers or right answers. Genuinely, this is the sorts of things that one has to think about when one's sort of. I know it's a toy example, but these are all as things get bigger. And office suites are huge things. Microsoft will have, for example, tens of thousands of people working on Office, and so they just won't be in the same place. They will be split up between teams. Products and functionalities, and they'll be in different time zones. These are all issues that people have to cope with, and there's probably there's unlikely to be a perfect solution to any of this. Okay, so in your case then, how would your teams talk to each other?
Probably similar to how.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, this is an area that is not lacking tools. Skype, Zoom, Slack, all that sort of thing is all right. Okay. Did anyone? And I sort of purposely didn't even sort of offer this as a sort of a thought to begin with. But did anyone consider with the remote people having them remote with the customer? Anyone consider that? Remote to the rest of the teams, but actually with the customer. So again, didn't mention it as a possibility. Just wondering if anyone had thought about it. That might be another way to think about it as well. Does anyone have any sort of anything wildly different they'd like to put forward at this stage? Any thoughts? Okay. So we're out of time really. I hope that was useful in the sense of